Story 1. Growing up in Topeka, Kansas, my little brother had an imaginary friend named Jonathan Akins. I remember vividly that my brother would get into trouble for playing in the creek, Soldier's Creek, behind our house, and he always blamed it on Jonathan, saying he asked my brother to go swimming with him. My parents, of course, were insistent that Jonathan was not real, and eventually my brother stopped seeing him. About 5 or 6 years later, I was taking a journalism class in high school, and we went on a field trip to the local newspaper, the Topeka Capital Journal. We were given an assignment to search the archives for an article that was personally relevant. I searched my family name and nothing came up. Then I searched my address and there was an article about a boy who died in Soldier's Creek near 29th and Girard, where my house was located. The boy's name? Jonathan Akins. Story 2. I moved out of a house once because it was haunted. My friend helped me move, and after loading the last items into the van, we were about to leave when we both heard running inside the empty house. As we reversed out of the driveway, we saw a figure at the window. I am now convinced. Story 3. I lived in my grandmother's house immediately after she passed. I invited friends over to play Dreamcast and have a few beers. I set expectations early on that the only rooms they were allowed in besides the kitchen and the living room were the bathroom just up the stairs. I was playing Ultimate Fighting Championship on Dreamcast when I saw someone walk from my grandmother's art room to the bathroom. It was less a shadow and more like a dark gray silhouette. I paused the game, looked around, did a quick head count and went back to playing. About 10 minutes later, I saw the same figure walk from the bathroom to my grandmother's art room. I saw a few people look up the stairs. I paused the game and asked them to describe what they saw. They said they saw someone walk from my bathroom to the room just off the hallway. I looked around, did another head count, found the same number of people and just said, "It must be my grandmother." People asked if my grandmother was okay with us partying in her house. I said, "Oh well, she died 3 weeks ago, so I don't think she's going to care too much." It freaked a lot of people out and a few left, but I never felt weird or anxious about it. I would occasionally see the silhouette after that. I talked loudly about my day when I came home from work and just lived my life until I moved out a while later. In the moment, though, I was thinking, what is in my house? The person was walking around like they were familiar with the place. Outside of the gatherings, we didn't allow people in our homes. Story 4. My piano started playing by itself. It lasted only 20 seconds. I was alone, so it scared me. I do not own a player piano. It is a normal piano. The part that makes me mad is that it was playing itself much better than I am able to play. Story 5. My neighbor died. We thought she had gone on holiday, but I kept having bad dreams. We called the police to do a welfare check, and they found her deceased. She had no family willing to assist with her death, as she had mild schizophrenia and shut them out, so it fell on me to identify the body. For the next 2 weeks, I felt a constant cold presence around me. I arranged a small memorial service for her with neighbors who knew her, and we wished her spirit well. Within 1 hour, I felt warm again and felt I had set her free in a dignified manner. After that, amazing things started happening for me, and now I am in a good place in life. I attribute it to my old neighbor's ghost. Story 6. A couple of things happened, but the most surprising for me was having my foot grabbed when I was in Salem. The hotel room was already creepy enough. The wind was especially loud that night, and the hotel was already haunted. There is a lot of history there. I felt something squeeze my foot hard for a couple of seconds and then let go. I jumped up and couldn't sleep. Took me a while to get comfortable. This happened to me a year ago. Story 7. Generally, when I stay in a hotel for work, I sleep on top of the covers because I get overly warm. I woke up at 1 a.m. feeling something gnawing on my thigh. It was not a small bite. It was something with a large mouth, roughly human-sized. I switched the light on in a panic, but there was nothing there. I spent the rest of the night under the covers, terrified, and later found a human-sized bite mark on my thigh while taking a shower and getting ready for work. Recently, I stayed in a hotel in Belfast, the Europa, and woke up when the room door opened. Someone came into the room and sat on the bed behind me. I couldn't move or turn to see who it was for a long time until I convinced myself that I could actually move if I wanted to. When I finally turned around and turned on the light, there was obviously no one there, but the bed had a depression in the duvet where someone had been sitting. Both incidents frightened me for days afterward, but I cannot find a rational explanation for either of them. Story 8. My cousin and I lived in a house built during the Civil War, about 100 yards away from where a man, his wife, and their daughter were all buried. The area was fenced in to prevent cows from trampling the stones. The grass had grown tall, so we jumped the fence to eat and clean the stones out of respect. We felt like we were getting stung, so we ran back to the house, thinking mud daubers or something were chasing us. After the all clear, I checked his back. We both had scratches across our backs. Not deep enough to break the skin, but enough to avoid that area. We also heard footsteps running across the hall and felt uneasy, as if we were being watched. That story was the only physical evidence. The house is located on Old 3L Highway in Falmouth, Kentucky. Story 9. Creepy, intense, blue-eyed people. I was a sophomore in college. I walked into my math class like any other day and sat in my usual spot, about 4 seats in on the 3rd row. Even though we didn't have assigned seats, there was always a girl sitting 2 seats to the left of me with an empty seat between us, and her male friend to her left. They seemed to be just good friends, always laughing, never giving me any reason for concern. This day in particular, I sat down, got my spiral notebook and pencil out, and quietly sat there looking forward, thinking about what I was going to do after class. Suddenly, I got an eerie feeling. I looked up to my left, and my heart practically stopped. The girl was staring straight at me, with a blank face, and her eyes were shining like a bright, piercing electric blue, shining like lasers. Nothing at all natural. I can't explain it accurately. I was basically paralyzed and couldn't move or say anything. I eventually blinked and looked forward, then looked back. The girl's head was turned back to her friend as he was talking again. About 2 years later, I was with friends driving to a restaurant. Traffic was building up since it was rush hour, and we were stopped in the right lane. I was in the back seat and happened to look up, diagonally to the left, through the windshield. I looked into the car sitting in the lane next to us. Its back bumper was parallel to our front bumper, so I could see the driver easily. He was turned almost completely around and looking back at me, staring intensely. Even from that distance, I could see his eyes were that same piercing, bright, laser-like blue, and I froze again. Just like the last incident, I was eventually able to blink, look away, and then immediately look back. The man was turned forward, the light turned green, and we all started moving. It's now been about 20 years, and I haven't experienced anything like that again, but it messed with my mind for a while. Story 10. I did not really believe in the paranormal then and still do not now. But one thing slightly shook my belief when I was 17. One night, before bed, I felt a huge sadness. I felt like there was something moving outside my bedroom, which I knew was impossible. I thought about my best friend and wondered if it was him outside my room, which again was nearly impossible. The next day, I found out he died suddenly about the same time. Story 11, maybe not the creepiest, but the most recent. I was at work last night at the hospital, and a coworker was giving me a sort of tour while we delivered something. I am still new and usually do not leave our department. We got to one floor and I instantly got the heebie-jeebies. It was almost like I heard a faint echo of screams and saw a flash of torture for the briefest second. We had to walk back down that hall, and for some reason my coworker said, "This floor used to be a psychiatric ward back in the day." Yes, I could tell. Story 12. I used to work in a bar that had been around since 1914. Multiple murders have been confirmed to have happened in the building. It was a speakeasy during Prohibition, and a brothel was next door. Many strange things happened after hours in the early mornings when the bar was empty. Bar stools would turn as though someone was sitting in them. I could hear random sounds from the bar while I was in the office doing paperwork, and no one else was in the building. These were regular occurrences, and I absolutely did not believe in the paranormal before working there. Story 13. I have a pretty odd view on ghosts in that they are more residual energy left behind by people and not actual entities. That being said, my childhood home was spooky. You could hear footsteps and see figures walking from room to room so often that it became normal for us. One time, I was sleeping in my basement and heard lips parting above my ear, like spit crackling, and a voice said, "Get up," very loudly. Scared me a lot. I never slept down there again. I like to sleep with masks that cover my ears or with a pillow over my head now because of it. Oddly, the sound of a mouth opening is still the creepiest part to me. My mom always told me I was being silly and that ghosts aren't real until we moved out. Then she told me she just said that so we wouldn't be scared and that she had experienced scary things like that while living there too. Story 14. I used to work at a house museum. 4 generations had lived in the home between the 1840s, when it was initially built, and 1912, when the last owner died. You can imagine multiple people died in that home, including the family who owned it and the people who worked for them. I want to point out I wasn't a believer in the paranormal until I worked there. But everyone on staff at this museum had a strange story of hearing voices or feeling presences. For example, my boss was cleaning part of the house and humming. He heard a woman's voice humming along with him from inside the house. The museum was closed, so he went to see if someone had snuck in. He ran to where he heard the voice. Stopped. No one was there. Then he heard giggling. I was once alone in my boss's office, which was on the second floor of the house's old granary. I heard 2 men's voices coming from below me. I looked out the window. There was no one. I went downstairs. There was no one. Then the voices stopped. One day I was giving a house tour to a couple. In the family parlor was a painting of the patriarch of the family who had owned the farm. I gave my usual information about him and then asked the couple if they had any questions. One of them asked, "What's that thing behind the man's head?" I had given dozens of house tours before. This was the first time I had noticed a shrouded figure in black next to the former owner's head, reaching out toward the viewer. Needless to say, this all spooked me. I never went into the house alone. But the main thing I learned is that most people who work in history museums absolutely believe in ghosts. Story 15, things being somewhere, then not being there, then being back there. Example, cooking spray is kept in the same place. I live alone. No one else uses it or moves it. The spray was in its place. I went to check it later to see if it was empty enough to add to the grocery list. The spray was just gone. I looked all over for it. It was completely gone. I bought a new one, and when I went to put it in the space, the old one was back. No one else could have done that. Where did it go, and when or how did it get back? This has happened with several things over the last few years. Every time I get a replacement, the original is back where it was supposed to be after disappearing. Story 16. Trigger warning. Suicide. My flatmate died by suicide in an outhouse in the backyard. I had gotten up early to go to work and was standing at the kitchen sink drinking some water, looking out the kitchen window which faces the outhouse. She had already passed away at this point. I vividly remember thinking, what is going on with that outhouse? I can only describe it as a thick black glow emanating from the only window, through which I could not see anything, and coming from the slightly ajar door. It was bizarre and unsettling. I went to work and received a call later that morning with the news. I described it to my mother, and she said that when her brother died in a hiking accident in the 1970s, she described looking at the mountain range he was missing in and seeing a black glow around it. Story 17. I had a wrench sitting in the exact middle of a table. It was a big, heavy wrench. I was watching something on my computer and heard a loud thud behind me. I turned around and the wrench was on the ground, about 2 feet from the table. I cannot explain what caused it to move because there was no wind, and it was too heavy to have been moved that far by a breeze. Story 18. I worked in a school. The site was fairly big and the buildings were starting to get old, built between 1850 and 1920. The building I was in was used as a World War I hospital for people to recuperate from shell shock. I went in one Saturday to prepare some materials for the next week and also to walk the dog, as the school's grounds are huge and it is a nice place to walk. My classroom was at the front of the building at the top of the main stone staircase. There was a much smaller rear staircase, presumably for the staff at the back of the building. It was only for staff as it was narrow and winding, with larger height between each step. There were 2 classrooms upstairs at the front and 1 at the back. I had been there for a few hours and was alone. I was tidying up, throwing away old things that were no longer needed and fixing parts of displays that were looking a bit untidy. The dog was sleeping after his walk. As I was straightening some reading books, I heard footsteps coming up the rear steps of the building. My first thought was that it was the teacher of the class at the rear of the building coming in to do some preparation for the following week. She had children in the school and often came in at the weekend when her children were on the site for sports training or a match. I had emailed her earlier about something, so I decided to go and speak to her to let her know I was there, so as not to startle her and to discuss the email. I got about 6 feet from the door to her room and began speaking to announce my presence. "Hi. Just wanted to let you know I'm here too. I sent you." As I rounded the corner, I noticed the lights were off. The building has automatic lighting when you walk into a room, and as I walked in, her room was empty. Confused, I walked back out and checked the copier room, which was a small room on the long corridor between the front and back of the building. I thought I would have heard her in there, but guessed I missed her as I walked past. As I opened the door to the copier room, it was obvious she was not there. Then I heard the footsteps on the stairs again, right at the top. I poked my head out of the copier room, and there was nothing there, even though the noise was clearly coming from exactly where I was looking. I was extremely frightened. I quickly walked back to my classroom at the front of the building. The dog was awake and displeased. His ears were laid back and his tail was between his legs. I picked up my car keys and exited through the fire door, slamming it behind me. I had no idea what was going on, but I never went in to do weekend preparation again. Story 19. I was working in an old Victorian manor house that had been turned into a wedding venue. I was repairing the boiler in the top floor hallway of the old servants' quarters when I saw a shadowy figure walking towards me and then disappearing about 10 feet in front of me. Story 20. When my son was about 3 years old, he sleepwalked one night while we were still awake in our room. We heard the static from the television in the living room and our son talking. He was staring at the television, as if he were having a conversation with someone. The television was on, showing only static. We had turned it off hours before. It was similar to the movie Poltergeist. He was in a trance and did not acknowledge us until we shook him awake. He said he had been talking to another little boy. 30 years later, it still freaks me out. Story 21. It did not convince me, but it gives me pause. Fairbridge Village is an old Australian federal school system that trained English and Aboriginal Australian children how to be, well, bluntly, farm laborers. They operate today more as a tourist attraction and for horticulture programs. I participated in one of these programs 1 year to satisfy Centrelink requirements and had to stay there overnight once or twice. It was me, a small blonde woman in my 20s, and about 4 men. Naturally, I slept in a separate room. This was in a small twin cabin on site. Anyway, I woke up and thought I heard a tape running in the little kitchen area. I got up to check it. No water, no tape running, and all the men were fast asleep. I shrugged and turned around. My light was on, I had not turned it on. I saw a shadow, I think, in the door. I was tired and not in the mood. I just said, "Oh, get out of here with that," thinking it was one of the men messing with me. My room has one way in or out. I walked to the door. No one was there. I turned off the light, shut the door, and went right back to sleep. The men insisted it was not them. Until now, I am still undecided about it. Story 22. It's a very early morning in December. I think it might have been the week of or just before Christmas. It's quiet and snowy, one of those very early mornings when no one is outside or even awake in their homes. It's a clear morning with very few clouds, and the moon is still up. From my house to work, it's less than a 10-minute walk across a long courtyard behind a church and right up to the lot. I'm just walking through the snow, listening to music. Feels silly, but I had the feeling to look up. And right then, coming out of a cloud, is a very bright, warm, spherical light. I've always thought of its size like a quarter held at arm's length. It's just beautiful and radiant, like a candle glowing without any flickering or sputtering. I'm lost in its light, comes out from the cloud and seems to almost stop right there over me. At this point, I start to lose my mind. I'm shouting in this open snowy field, pointing, just flabbergasted. I fumble with my phone and it clicks in my mind how shaky camera footage of unintelligible lights exists. Just as I'm starting to take my first steps, it gently starts to move again, does a very neat U-turn, and disappears over some trees. No noise, no fanfare, nothing. Just silent, beautiful, and it felt so unattached to the world around it. Story 23. Not me, but my dad. My dad tells me that when I was a little kid, around 4, I went to him and said we needed to visit Chile to see my grandpa, his father, because he was going to die that year. They had a really bad relationship, so my dad and my mom did not even talk about grandpa at home. A few weeks later, my dad got the news from his sister that grandpa had passed away. My dad also tells me that at the same age, one day my mom was at the farmer's market near our house while I was in the living room with my dad watching TV, and I was sitting on the floor playing. I suddenly turned to him and said, "Mom is running from bad people, but it is okay because the store man pulled her inside so she could hide." My dad did not think much of it until it started to take a really long time for my mom to come back. Mom did not have a cell phone or anything. This was the 1990s in Brazil, so he waited at home with me until my mom finally arrived hours later, shaken up. There had been a robbery gone wrong at the bank right in front of the farmer's market. The robbers came out shooting, and everyone in the farmer's market started running and panicking because the robbers were running through the market and shooting. Mom ran, and a store employee pulled her inside his store before closing the doors. Other people from the farmer's market had taken shelter inside as well. My dad was freaked out. He always tells the story to say that that's when he started believing in supernatural stuff because I just stared at him and described what was going on with Mom and then immediately went back to playing. I have no memory of either of these things. Story 24. I was home alone, just sitting and feeding my dogs when I suddenly heard a sound coming from another room. The strange part was that the room was locked and the light was off. I knew for sure no one else was in the house, just me. Still, I went over, unlocked the door, turned on the light, and saw the ceiling fan was running. I have no idea how it got turned on. No one believes me when I talk about it, but it honestly scared me. Story 25. It wasn't exactly creepy, but I was looking at what I thought was an airplane outside my window overlooking the Union Square area. New York City is not the best place to imagine airplanes, and I don't really expect anyone to take this seriously, but the lights from that plane zoomed out of my vision as soon as I started wondering why it was coming into Newark from that angle. It literally zipped across my vision so fast it looked like a green laser pointing from where the object was to where it was going, which was southeast. Story 26. We're all pretty sure our house was haunted. We heard footsteps upstairs when no one else was home, dishes rattling, saw our front door open and the shadow of feet, but no one was there. The radio suddenly turning to a creepy symphonic orchestra and scared a contractor so badly he refused to be alone in the house. Things like that. When we started the process of selling, the realtor called and asked if we had kids in the house because she could hear running and giggling upstairs while showing the house. Story 27. My friend used to live in a haunted house. His bedroom was in the attic of the home. There was a storage room beside his bedroom. The door to the storage room was hidden and looked just like the wall. It swung open and had a hook latch to keep it closed. One day, about 6 of us were all piled on his bed just talking, and I was sitting with my back against the door just relaxing. Suddenly, something kicked or hit the door 3 times really hard from inside the room. I felt it on my back. I jumped up, opened the door, and looked in. To our surprise, there was nothing there. We all laughed and shrugged it off. As I closed the door and hooked the latch, something hit the door so hard that the latch broke and the door flew wide open. We all looked at each other, and I had never seen 6 people run so fast down the stairs. We told his dad, who was downstairs, what happened. He casually said, "You don't ever go in that room. There's a really angry ghost in there, and he will hurt you." Then he showed us a cut on his head and said he went in there for a box and something hit him in the head. Very creepy. This is just one of many experiences I had in that house. Story 28. I have a couple of experiences to share. I had a dream where this great aunt that I never met was going to die. Then I saw her ghost in her grave. She greeted me there and told me to tell my parents about it. 3 days later, she did in fact die. My mom looked at me strangely because I never met that aunt. I had a dream where a country was experiencing an extreme number of earthquakes. However, that is not the strange part because several countries have earthquakes. The unusual part was that I saw a bride running while buildings were collapsing. When I woke up, the news said Lebanon and Turkey had huge earthquakes, and I then saw the same bride in a video running with the same grayish buildings. Everything, including the dress, was the same. I also met some entities in my dreams that were not human but rather demons, not the bad kind of demons you might be thinking of. We believe demons can be good or bad, like humans. They would ask me things. The thing is, I am not the only one in my family who has seen this family of demons. My grandmother did too. However, she died because of two of them. I know not many people believe this, but I genuinely believe humans, animals, and plants are not the only beings in this world, and that our dimension is not the only one. Story 29. I used to laugh at ghost stories and was a full-blown atheist. But one April evening, walking home from tuition in the scorching Indian summer, I felt a firm, tight hand slap my shoulder from behind. I spun around instantly, no one, just an empty road. My blood ran cold. I had watched The Conjuring the night before, and suddenly every line from that film echoed in my head like a twisted prophecy. I couldn't sleep and couldn't think straight for months. That night shattered my beliefs, and if something that dark could touch me, then maybe there really is a force of good too. Story 30. After we moved into our house, we cleaned out junk in the attic. We found a bunch of old creepy dolls. They were still in pretty good shape, so we kept them for a little while to see if they were worth anything. During that time, both of us would see a silhouette of a man in a top hat out of the corners of our eyes. Our cat and dog also reacted to this. Several visitors to the house mentioned seeing a man in a top hat pass through another room. I don't think he ever did anything. There was no poltergeist activity, just the silhouette walking around. We found a place to get rid of the dolls, and no one has seen him in the house since. Story 31. I am not convinced of the paranormal, but years ago I saw security footage from an old job of a locked and alarmed door, which was never used, just opening on its own. There was no wind outside, no earthquake, or anything else we could think of. The manager received an alert and blamed the night crew, but the system showed the door locked, the camera showed it closed, then the cameras clearly showed the bar move and the door open. No one was outside on camera either. I know there must be a normal explanation, but I have no viable ideas. I thought the worker who showed me the footage was messing with me, but it became a real issue that management got involved in because of security. Both the manager and owner were baffled and unhappy. Story 32. I was with my partner, and we were discussing names for our son. I started thinking in my head, not out loud, of old prime ministers, and the name Walpole occurred to me. I am sure I did not say anything. Then my partner said, "How about Walpole?" It is possible that I said something out loud, but I do not remember doing so, and my partner said I did not, and the name just occurred to her. I have never heard of anyone with the first name Walpole before. Story 33. Not actually creepy, but we had our dog euthanized in our home, and at almost the same instant that he drew his last breath, the phone's voicemail alert went off. It was a dog barking. The phone itself did not ring beforehand, nor was there a voicemail message. Story 34. This happened about 10 years ago. I never told anyone but my wife. We lived in a pretty old apartment at the time. For context, in our bedroom we had a Las Vegas memorabilia wall with souvenirs on some glass shelves hanging on the wall. One of the items was a metal bucket filled with loose change. I had just built a new personal computer, so I was playing a game in the bedroom. My wife was closing that night, so she was not home. Suddenly, I heard a massive crash behind me. I nearly had a heart attack. I jumped up from my seat and turned around, thinking I was about to see a random person ready to rob or harm me. I saw the bucket of change all over the floor. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at it in disbelief. I finally worked up the courage to run to the kitchen and grab the biggest knife I could find. I slowly checked every room and closet. My heart was pounding. I should have called the police, but I heard nothing else except the sound of the bucket and change falling. No doors opened, nothing. The apartment was completely empty. Still stunned, I cleaned up the bucket and change from the floor and put it back on the shelf. I got a level out. The shelf was completely level. I tried sliding the bucket. There was absolutely no way it could slide off the shelf unless someone intentionally knocked it off. There was zero wind, and all windows were closed. The bucket was too heavy anyway to blow off. It had been sitting there just fine for months. I let it go, thinking maybe it was just a fluke. A few weeks passed with no incident. Then one night, my wife was closing again. The exact same thing happened. It scared me terribly again. Only this time, I knew there was nobody else in the apartment. I still stood there in disbelief. I cleaned it up again. That bucket never went back on the shelf. I never had any other incidents in that apartment besides these 2 times, and we lived there for 10 years. The man who lived in the ground unit had died by suicide a few months prior in the building. Sometimes I wonder if it was him. Story 35. Well, I would not say scary in the scary sense, but it was something that took me by surprise. A few years ago, I was a follower of an Afro-Brazilian religion called Umbanda. In this religion, deities called orixás and spirits of the dead are invoked, and practitioners are possessed by them. Possession is not the best expression because it suggests that this happens by force, when in fact it is allowed by the follower. During these moments, the spirits communicate with us. One of these spirits, an indigenous woman called Cabocla Jurema, was scolding me because I was not concentrating on the Jira. That is what we call our cults. For example, Catholics have Mass, we have the Jira. Anyway, the Cabocla said, "You need to focus on the work, feel the leaves on the ground under your feet." I thought to myself, this Cabocla is crazy. There are no leaves on the ground. The spirit responded exactly like this. "You think I am crazy, and that there are no leaves on the ground. There are. You just cannot see them." I know that some people might say it is a trick, that guessing thoughts is something that street magicians do. But how could the person repeat what I thought with exactly the same words? For me, it is proof that something exists beyond this world. Story 36. I stayed at a friend's house one night in my early 20s and left to walk home early the next morning. I turned the corner at the end of the driveway and saw someone on the other side of the road. I thought they were walking until I realized there were no legs. I freaked out and ran back to the house. For your information, I was not hungover or under the influence. I was completely sober, and I know what I saw. It still creeps me out more than 20 years later. Story 37. Took a picture of my friend 8 years ago. Looking at the picture, I realized that a face was floating next to his, which looked like the drama masks. I still have no idea what that was, but we agreed never to discuss it. Story 38. I feel and see moving shadows out of place at my work and get brief, occasional tingles throughout my body afterward. Story 39. In the early 2000s, I worked in a casino whose adjoining hotel apparently had some rooms and a hallway where people had seen something move through walls or appear in hallways. This was the Treasury Casino Brisbane, Australia, if anyone cares. One night shift, probably around 3 a.m., I went for a break and one of the kitchen cleaning crew was in the employee dining room. He was visibly upset. Not fooling around, genuinely scared. He was a Filipino man, decent, friendly, quiet, and very Catholic, so I had never seen him like that. He said he had been cleaning the hot section in the kitchen when he saw the thing, which he described as gray and vaguely human-shaped, soundlessly appear and move through the kitchen wall into one of the adjoining haunted rooms. He said he was leaning over the hot plates and it appeared in his right eye peripheral vision. When he turned toward the movement, he saw it. I attributed this to it being 3 a.m. and we were all tired. He may have seen it in his periphery, and his eyes and tired brain were playing tricks on him. About an hour later, I had to go into the spooky room. I turned on the light and walked in. It did feel strange in there, as did the hallway, but it is hard to describe the strangeness. Amusingly, any spookiness was ruined by the spare bar fridge humming with its bright Coke sign and the trays and other standard hospitality items stored there. But Jose refused to work that kitchen alone on a night shift after that. Make of it what you will. Definitely an odd night. But paranormal? I am not sure. Story 40. Possibly just a strange coincidence, but my watch stopped telling time one day at work, and the second hand was pulsating like a heartbeat. Eventually, it stopped. I did not think much about it until I found out my grandfather had passed at roughly the same time, give or take 5 minutes, when the watch died. Story 41. I don't know if it is creepy, but my mother died when I was 25 and when I had my son. I swear I woke up in the middle of the night to see her hovering near his bassinet. I kind of loved it. Story 42. I was very close to my grandmother, but I never dreamed about her. One night I dreamt of her house. I was desperately searching for her and calling out, but I could not find her. I heard her voice say, "It's okay. I have to go. I love you," from what sounded like another room. I woke up to a call from my mother, who was crying and telling me that my grandmother had died overnight. Story 43. My childhood home experienced some unusual events. Nothing harmful, but definitely ghosts. When we first moved there when I was 5, I was looking out the living room window and saw a young boy and girl running in the yard. They wore vintage-style clothes and appeared white and translucent. My mother has seen some things. She does not drink, do drugs, or take medications, so I believe her. One time, my father woke her up with a coughing fit. He later developed pneumonia. It was around 2 a.m. When she woke up, she saw a translucent lady standing over my father. The lady wore a robe and had her hair in tight curlers. The next day, my mother told our elderly neighbor about it. The neighbor said my mother had accurately described the previous owner. The unusual part is that the lady appeared where the previous owner had passed away. My mother did not tell me this until I was much older. Another time, when I was in elementary school around 5th grade, my friend secretly brought a Ouija board because my mother was strongly against them. At that time, I did not know she had seen things. We were using the board in my bedroom when suddenly my cat, who had been sound asleep on the bed, stood up, arched her back with all her hair standing straight up, and ran out of the room. My dog also refused to enter my room. Story 44. That is honestly chilling. It might not be textbook paranormal, but it definitely has that eerie, unexplained vibe, especially with your sister experiencing the exact same thing. The deep voice counting, getting louder with each number, in the middle of a fevered haze, that is the kind of thing that sticks with you. Even if it was just a strange fever dream, the fact that it happened to both of you makes it much harder to brush off. Story 45. I went outside on a moonlit, foggy night. I walked into the fog and felt strange, as if television static had a physical sensation. My vision became unusual, and my body felt off, though I did not lose consciousness. Story 46. My uncle died and my neighbor's cat died. That night, she was upset and came over. She asked me, "Do you think Mr. Kitty is in heaven?" Before I could answer, 5 hanging European American patterned glass goblets started ringing. Celia screamed, "It's Mr. Kitty. It's Mr. Kitty. He's telling me." I laughed and said, "No, it's not Mr. Kitty. It's my Uncle Chuck." The hanging goblets rang again, not before or since. The goblets are from the 19th century and belong to my husband's grandmother. Story 47. My grandfather and I were very close, but he was generally not well liked in my family. He died when I was in high school, and my family promptly stopped talking about him or acknowledging his existence. There are no pictures of him or anything. When my son was around 1.5 years old, he was playing on the floor and suddenly turned and started waving at the wall. I jokingly asked who he was waving at, and he responded in a perfectly clear voice with the nickname I had given my grandfather as a child. I am absolutely certain that he had never heard that name before. He was also slow to start talking, so to say it so clearly was surprising. Since then, I have been a true believer in the paranormal. Story 48. In my dorm in college, the bathroom sink would turn on by itself. It did this consistently for a month, and you could turn the knob to turn it off. It was not like water started rushing out on its own. Something or someone must have turned on the faucet using the knob. During the same month, I remember waking up in my dorm room in the middle of the night in a trance state. A woman or entity was beside my bed. It was about 5 feet tall and looked like a blob of white, cream, or light gray sheets. I suppose I could have dreamt this. I was living in a small single room at that time. My alma mater is St. Mary's College in Notre Dame, Indiana, United States of America. People have reported paranormal and ghost activity while at the college. I never believed in the paranormal until that year as a student. Story 49. I was driving home one night. My wife called me, freaking out. We lived in an old farmhouse. She was hysterical. She said all the kids' toys were going off in the house at once. I could hear them. Then bam. My headlights went out in my truck. My truck was new. I pulled into a driveway trying to calm her down. Then the toys stopped. My lights came back on. A few weeks later, my brother was over. I was telling him the story when his cell phone rang. It was my house line calling his cell phone. The house phone was hung up. Story 50. I lived in a quad with a basement unit for several years. I would occasionally hear my upstairs neighbor singing. Sometimes it was popular radio music, sometimes the national anthem, sometimes a Muslim call to prayer, and sometimes what sounded like ritual chanting. It was very eclectic and occasionally unsettling. Several years later, I moved into that apartment. Some nights, my wife would sit up in the middle of the night and tell me someone was in the apartment. I would search but never found anything. It grew progressively stranger until she woke me to say she felt something staring at her directly above in our room. We started sleeping sort of on our pull-out couch. One day, while making food, I placed the salt and pepper on the back of the stove against the wall. When I reached to return the salt, there was a gap between the stove and the wall that had not been there before. I would have dropped the salt behind the stove if I had tried to place it in its usual spot. The stove had, for no clear reason, moved a few inches away from the wall. Other similar occurrences happened that unsettled us, and some friends came to pray over our apartment. We moved after living there for a year and never experienced anything like that again. Story 51. Quite a few throughout my lifetime. To relate two of them, in my parents' bedroom, they had a dresser with a mirror opposite the bed. If you were sitting on the bed looking in the mirror, you would sometimes see a woman's hand among the unmade bedclothes behind you. You would also smell smoke on rainy days and see a small black cat run past the living room and down the hallway. The house itself was an old military duplex that my parents had purchased and moved onto our property. During remodeling, we found bullet holes under the paneling in what became my parents' room. There was also evidence, such as damaged wood and rafters that had been replaced, indicating a fire in what became our kitchen. Story 52. I work nights in a 100-year-old museum, a place with many historically significant artifacts and extensive lore about its construction and architects. One night, I was alone near one of our theaters. The place had been closed for hours, and no one was on that side of the campus. I heard a woman scream as if she were being attacked. I got goosebumps. I checked the entire area but found no one. Although alarmed, I continued and entered another area with office spaces. As I walked through the offices, pieces of paper fell off desks. The area felt cold, and I had a strong feeling of being followed. I entered an elevator, and it felt like someone was breathing down my neck. I quickly left the area, and the feeling disappeared. This happened about 10 years ago. The scream was heard again last week by one of my employees. We searched the area again but found no one. However, my employee was so spooked she was shaking. Story 53. My mom, my older sister, and I were arguing. I can't remember what about, but it started to get heated. My mom keeps a big pink lunchbox filled with odds and ends, screws, nuts, bolts, and all sorts of little potentially useful things for one day. It was very heavy. We were all on one side of the room, and the lunchbox was sitting on the other end of the kitchen table. Then it slid quickly across the table toward us. We all fell silent and stared, then quietly dispersed after being startled. Story 54. I moved in with my grandfather to care for him during late-stage Alzheimer's. I lived in the basement in-law suite for around 1.5 years before he passed. and for a while we worked on cleaning the place up to eventually sell. Shortly after he passed, maybe a couple of weeks later, I was downstairs just getting into bed when I heard footsteps upstairs. They were very distinct footsteps, not an animal on the roof or something else. Immediately, I panicked because I'm a woman in my 20s alone in a house. I then received 2 notifications on my phone from the dining room and living room security cameras that movement was detected. I checked the footage and there was nothing. I texted a friend and asked them to call the police and tell them there was an intruder at my address. I didn't want to call myself in case the intruder heard me and knew someone was home. The footsteps continued, going from room to room. About 10 minutes later, I saw flashlights passing by the basement windows. The police had arrived. My friend called me back, and the police told them to tell me to come to the back door, so I did. They said they performed a perimeter check of the property and house. All doors were locked, and there weren't any signs of forced entry. They told me to stay where I was while they completed a full sweep of the house. Nothing. No one. 3 officers did the sweep, so it's not like someone could have snuck out while they were searching. The upstairs of the house was down to the studs at this point, and there was no accessible attic, so there were no hiding spots. I didn't sleep for 3 days after that incident and still don't have an explanation. Story 55. I am pretty sure I have been experiencing harassment by a ghost this past month. Take that as you will. I also know my luck is not good enough for it to be anything but a male. Story 56. I have had a few experiences with ghosts, but there is one that really stands out to me. I got a promotion at work and bought a nice bottle of whiskey to celebrate. My partner and I opened it later that night and started to have a few sips when we heard a bang behind us. We could not immediately find the source until we saw a dent in the ceiling that perfectly matched the walking stick on the ground below. A little freaked out, we finished our drink and started to head to bed. On the floor, we found a folded note that said, "You forgot," in handwriting that did not match either of us. We checked the house, but no one else was there. Unsettled, we sat in bed for about 15 minutes while we heard knocking on the walls. Then it hit us. My partner's brother had passed away a few years prior and loved whiskey. We always poured out a shot of whiskey for him when we opened a bottle and did not do it this time. We both got up and went to the kitchen to open the bottle again. Once we uncorked it, the cork flew off the counter and sailed about 15 feet before rolling away. We turned to get it when a flash of red erupted behind us. We poured the shot and had a small toast, then poured out his shot outside. We came back into a calmer house with less knocking on the cabinets and walls. He knocked intelligently and answered questions, then kept knocking as we tried to sleep. He finally stopped when we told him to leave us alone and let us sleep. He came back on multiple occasions. I have seen smoke behave strangely around him, objects move, and have felt hands on me that were not there. He was free to come and go and visited us a lot. We eventually moved out of there, and he does not show up nearly as much. But he certainly made living there interesting. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.